Hello to everyone in our audience, and especially to those of you watching from schools right now. My name is Duncan Dykes, and welcome to Doc Edge 2022. So today we have with us the director of Who I Am, Naomi Ball. Naomi, so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Now, I'm going to get us started with a couple of questions, and then at a certain point, we'll go to some questions from our audience. So if you're watching from a classroom right now, you can type in questions on the YouTube live stream link, and then we'll be able to bring those up later. So, Naomi, the first question I wanted to ask you was, how did you first encounter this story? What was the initial motivator for thinking this should be a film?
Well, I first encountered Ather and Ather when I was working on a campaign for a charity that they're linked with. And I met Ather when he was still using another name, but he actually hadn't come out to his mum as trans yet. But on the day that I met him, he let me know that his pronouns were he, him, and they, them. And I kept in touch with him because I was interested to know how things would go with his mum. And that was from a really sort of, you meet young people sometimes and you see that I saw that Ather was at a time when he needed a bit of support. Just so happened I'm from the queer community as well. So I just wanted to make sure that he got through that really tricky time of coming out. I've had to come out to my own parents as a lesbian, and it is a really hard time. So I kept in touch, and then through that a friendship developed, and not just with Ather, but with Anthea as well. And Anthea asked me one day when they were planning to travel around Australia in a camper van for a year, she said, "Hey, it would be so cool if you could come and film us." And I think she maybe regretted those words because I just said, "Yeah, it would be really cool. Can I?" And then I did. I went and filmed them. Me and the cinematographer that I worked with a lot on this, Charles. We both went to film Anthea, Ather, and the family as they travelled around Australia, and that's how it started. And I hadn't actually figured out the story when I went up to film in Cape York. I just thought, on a hunch, really, that there could be something there. That here was this sort of pivotal moment for Ather and for his whole family. And so I thought I'll go up, I'll do some filming and see what comes of it. And then as we were filming and going through the footage and I had time to think about it, I realized that there was this strong story of what it's like to be a teenager who's both trans and neurodivergent. That's also when I found out that there's actually that's a common crossover. You're more likely to be trans if you're autistic or neurodivergent, and vice versa. So when I found that out, I was like, wow, this is interesting. Also, I haven't seen anything about this before. And I thought there was a real opportunity to tell this story.
Thank you for that. You talk about having met Ather at a young age. Can you talk a bit about what the dynamic was like on set? I mean, how comfortable were they with putting their life on screen?
Yeah, so Ather was really comfortable. They're quite a brave person. And also they're really motivated by wanting to help others. So, and that's something that motivates them in lots of areas of their life. But in particular, one of those areas is wanting to be an activist, if you like, for the queer community and for the autistic community. And so they were really on board with sharing their story and having us film with them. And I think because I'd known them already for a little while and I'm from the queer community as well, I was also careful to work with, wherever I could, work with people who I felt were really sensitive and could relate to young people or might also be from the queer community. So lots of our cinematographers were from the queer community as well, or they were great with young people. So I think that made for a really comfortable environment for Ather and enabled him to open up.
Thank you for that. So another thing is we have some young filmmakers in our audience today. Are you able to speak a little bit about what were some of the biggest things as a director approaching this story that you wanted to focus on in terms of the execution of the film?
Well, as a director, I see myself as working with the participants in my documentaries to tell their story. So I don't see myself as coming in and putting my lens on their experience. I really want to try and bring to the fore how they feel, what their experience is, and do it in a way that's really respectful. And I think what you get from that is a more nuanced film that actually shows you more accurately what that experience is like, and it's often more relatable as a viewer. So that's what I try and do. And then how do I do that? Well, with Ather and Anthea, I was constantly having conversations with them throughout the filmmaking process around what's okay for us to talk about, what's not okay for us to talk about, what's okay for us to film, what's not okay. And always, I guess, giving them an opt-out. So it's like, yes, you've opted in to be in this film and we're doing this, and they're on board. But they also need to have that option of saying, this is too far. I don't think I am comfortable talking about that. And we would often have those conversations off camera, over the phone before I'm coming onto set, or just as you're going through without the camera being there, so that it is in a way where there's no pressure. And the other part of it that I wanted to do is bring to life Ather's experience. So using Ather's incredible talents and skills as an artist and an animator to bring the animated world, which also shares with us, I guess, things that are hard to film visually. They're really introspective, emotional things. That's what we use the animation for. And the other parts were kind of filming from his perspective. So working with the cinematographer to try and choose shots, angles, frame sizes that give you the feeling that you're in the room, and that at times you're right there with Ather, either next to him or you are him. So we're filming through his eyes. And then the other side of it was for a lot of autistic people, and for Ather, there can be sensory overload. So noises can be heightened, and everything can feel huge at times in terms of light and noise. And so in the sound design, we worked really hard to, in some areas, like in the scene where he's at the Trans Pride event, for example, when we were looking at the sound design, maybe for another film, I might have been more like, okay, we need to get rid of all this background noise. But for this, it was like, well, actually, for Ather, being in that space, there was a lot of noise and it is overwhelming and distracting. So using the sound design to mirror his experience in places. And then it was the same with the composition as well. So with the music composition, worked closely with our composer to make sure that the music itself was more emotional rather than melodic. So it really communicates the different feelings of Ather throughout the film. And yeah, so those were the types of decisions we made as a director. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for that. You talk a little bit about using Ather's drawings of the Fallens for the kind of incorporating that throughout the film. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, is this your first time using animation for a film?
It is my first time using animation for a film. And it was really driven by Ather and that being their medium of communicating with the world. Because I myself, I'm not a big consumer of animated film. So it was a really new territory for me. And as a director, it was probably one of the more challenging parts of my role in terms of I wasn't that experienced at working with animation. So I really enjoyed the process, and it seemed like a no-brainer. Like when you spend a lot of time with Ather, he is literally drawing all the time. It's hard to get him to stop and do something else. So we had to have that in there. And sometimes I think as they've grown older and now they're 17, Ather's really great at explaining his experience to other people. But early on, when we were filming, when he was around 14, sometimes hearing him talk about what was going on with his characters and what was happening in their world was actually an easy way of understanding what was going on with Ather. So it just made absolute sense that we should have the Fallens in the film and that they would be a big part of it.
And I thought it was quite nice seeing in the credits that Ather's credited as character designer for the Fallens as well.
Yeah, certainly. So that will be his first film credit. But I'm sure there'll be many more to come.
Well, one other thing I wanted to ask about, something I thought was very interesting and emotional in the film was hearing Anthea talk about wanting to be affirming of Ather's experiences, but coming from certain sort of ingrained thought processes. Are you able to speak a bit about what you hope someone, say, from an older generation would take away from watching this film?
Well, I would hope that someone from an older generation, either if you're a parent or a grandparent, that in watching this film, you might have been able to relate to some of Anthea's feelings, but then also would have been able to see how supporting a young person in their gender identity, how profound that is for their well-being and how important it is to do that, and that you might personally have challenges with that, but that it's important to, like Anthea, go on that journey and get to the point where you feel like you can really accept, support, and be there for that young person in the way that they need you. And to really challenge your own assumptions. So I'm hoping that you would be able to relate to Anthea and follow her example. I think Anthea did find it really challenging, and that in turn was really challenging for Ather. And maybe if you've watched this and then you find out later that your child or your grandchild is trans, maybe it will mean that you can start from a point earlier on the journey than Anthea did. Because I think if you can support your child like straight away, that's going to make such a huge difference for their mental health and emotional well-being.
Thank you for that. We're going to go now to some questions from our audience. So our first question is from Sky. Can you talk about any traps or cliches you wanted to avoid in making a film about this subject?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I didn't want to film a pride march. That was one of the cliches I wanted to avoid. I feel like you see a pride march in every film about the queer community. And we actually questioned whether or not to include the trans pride event because we were like, oh, is that a bit of a cliche? And also because I think sometimes when you see a lot of films from the queer community that have these sort of loud events, it's not reflective of most people's experience. Like, you know, there's the whole spectrum of extroverts to introverts, and not everyone wants to be going to an event where there's lots of colour and vibrance and or walking down the middle of the street like waving their rainbow flag. But we ended up including it because of the connections that Ather made with the other kids at that event. And it was really beautiful to see Ather making friends. And so that's why we included that. Other traps or cliches, we didn't want to have too much of, we didn't want to have any like makeover scenes, which you sometimes see in films about trans people. And I guess the other thing I didn't want to fall into from the autistic or neurodivergent perspective is I didn't want to, well, first of all, it's my experience. I have friends that are autistic or neurodivergent, and really they just feel like I don't really notice too much of a difference. I know that they have challenges in some areas, but when I watch on something like Love on the Spectrum, which I do enjoy, sometimes I feel like it can trivialize their experience of being autistic or neurodivergent. So I wanted to make sure I didn't do that with this. I didn't want to be patronizing in my portrayal of that, and just wanted to show it as it was. So what you see really is just how it is for Ather, for Anthea, for Hayley and William. They have challenges, but you know, they're not stereotypes of what you might think an autistic person is.
Well, thank you for that. Our next question is from Ida. How did your idea of the film change over the course of making it? You said that when you started out, you didn't know exactly where the story was going to take you.
Well, it changed a few times. So when I first thought this will be something great to film, I thought it was going to be just filming them going around Australia. And my idea was that it would be having Ather going on his social transition journey, and then set against the backdrop of a family traveling around Australia in a camper van and all of the drama that happens on the road. And they certainly did have some drama that happened on the road. There were broken chassis, and you might notice that there was a tent at the beginning, or like a camper trailer at the beginning, and a caravan at the end of their journey. That's because the camper trailer is no more. But in the end, we didn't include those things, and the story changed because they had to come back to Melbourne. So that was the first change. And then we had the pandemic hit. That was the second thing that really influenced how the story played out. So what that meant is it became a longer story. It meant that I was with Ather and his family for 3 years rather than a year. It meant that we got to see Ather grow up, and I think that really enriched the film so much. It meant that Ather's timeline for access to gender-affirming medical care was stretched out. So, and they actually still haven't been able to access that. So initially I thought we would end with that being sort of the end point for Ather, being able to access gender-affirming medical care, but that wasn't the ending in the end. So it's changed a bit, and it just changed because it's an observational documentary at its heart, and Ather's life unfolded, and so the story changed as Ather's life did. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We have one more question from Finn. With the opening voiceovers of news people talking about trans politics, were these taken from any particular sources or countries, or were they voice actors kind of speaking to the theme?
So that's archival audio taken from, it's all Australian, and taken from news article, like news stories from parliamentary broadcast recordings, all in Australia. Yeah, if I can talk a little bit more about that if it's of interest. But recently in Australia, there was a lot of debate over, unfortunately, a lot of debate over the rights of transgender children and youth, and their rights to not be discriminated against. And that is where a lot of that archival audio came from. So the debates that were happening in Parliament, and then also the news stories that were reported on that particular issue.
Well, thank you for that. I believe that might be all the time that we have. But thank you again so much for joining us and talking to us about the film.
No worries. It was great to speak with you, Duncan, and also get those questions from the audience as well.
For those of you watching in our audience as well, the film is still available to watch in our virtual cinema until the 10th of July. So I really recommend checking it out. We've also got more than 100 other films and short films that are really, really worth checking out. Otherwise, once again, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Duncan.
All right. Bye.
Bye.